The little girl had no idea she was being watched. She walked down the cracked sidewalk, her small pink backpack bouncing against her shoulders with each step. It was just another ordinary afternoon, or at least that's what she thought. A few steps behind her, three men kept their distance. Dressed in plain clothes, they blended into the neighborhood, their eyes fixed on the child. They weren't criminals, nor were they strangers with bad intentions. These men were police officers, and they had a reason for following her. But why? What could an 8-year-old girl have done to get the attention of not one, not two, but 3 undercover cops? She didn't steal anything. She wasn't in trouble. In fact, she wasn't even aware of their presence. She simply hummed to herself, kicking a small pebble along the path as she neared her house. The officers exchanged glances, their faces tense. They had received a call earlier that day, something strange, something that didn't sit right with them. They were told to keep an eye on this girl, to watch where she went. They didn't expect to get personally involved. They thought it would be a routine check, nothing more. But as they followed her quietly, something inside them told them that this was far from routine. The girl reached her house, a small, aging home with peeling paint and a rusty mailbox. She skipped up the front steps and reached for the doorknob. But before she could turn it, she froze. A shadow moved inside. Her fingers hovered over the handle. Her little face scrunched in confusion. She knew her mother should be home, but something felt off. Normally, she would hear music playing from the kitchen, or the scent of dinner cooking would greet her the moment she stepped onto the porch. But this time, there was only silence. The officers watched from a distance, their hands instinctively moving to their holsters. One of them, the tallest of the 3, took a cautious step forward. He didn't like this. He had been a cop for years, and his gut told him that something wasn't right. The little girl turned her head slightly, as if she could feel someone behind her. But before she could act, before she could call out for her mother, the door creaked open, slowly, as if someone on the other side had been watching her approach. And then, in an instant, everything changed. What happened next left the officers stunned. It was something they never expected, something that would haunt them for a long time. And it all unfolded in just 5 minutes. Stay with me, because you're not going to believe what happened next. The little girl's breath hitched as the door inched open. A sliver of darkness stretched across the threshold, and for a moment she didn't move. She just stood there, her small fingers still curled around the strap of her backpack. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the quiet. Maybe it was the way the house suddenly felt unfamiliar, as if it wasn't hers at all. The 3 officers remained where they were, watching from the other side of the street. They weren't supposed to intervene, not yet. Their orders were to observe, to gather information. But as the seconds dragged on, tension gripped them. The tallest officer clenched his jaw, his fingers twitching near his side. He could feel it in his gut. Something wasn't right. The little girl took a cautious step forward. "Mom," she called, her voice small, uncertain. No answer. She swallowed hard, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. Normally, her mother would have already rushed to the door, arms wide, asking about her day. But now, nothing. Just the faint sound of the wind rustling the trees in the yard. The officers exchanged quick glances. The shortest of the 3, a man with sharp eyes and a steady grip, whispered under his breath, "She's hesitating." The girl placed one foot inside. The hardwood floor creaked beneath her sneakers. A strange smell lingered in the air. Not bad, not necessarily wrong, but different. It wasn't the usual scent of her mom's vanilla candles or the fabric softener from the laundry. It was something she couldn't quite place. The officers stiffened as she pushed the door open further. And then, movement. A shadow shifted inside the house. Just a flicker, but enough for the girl to see. Her breath caught in her throat. Someone was there. She took a step back, and suddenly, the door slammed shut. The officers sprang into action. The tallest one, the one with the gut feeling, was the first to move. He didn't wait for orders. He dashed across the street, his boots hitting the pavement hard. The other two followed, hands hovering near their belts. Inside the house, the little girl stumbled backward, her heart hammering. The door was closed now. Her fingers fumbled for the handle, but before she could grab it, "Sweetheart." The voice came from inside, soft, almost gentle, but something was off. She turned, her breath shaky. A man stood in the dim hallway, his figure barely visible in the shadows. He wasn't her mother. He wasn't anyone she knew. Outside, the officers reached the front door. The tallest one knocked hard. "Police, open up." Silence. The little girl didn't move. Her feet felt glued to the floor. The voice spoke again. "It's okay, sweetheart. No need to be scared." The officers knocked again, this time louder. "Police, if anyone's inside, open the door now." Still nothing. Inside, the girl's small hands curled into fists. She didn't know what to do. She wanted to run, to get away. But where? The windows were locked. The back door was too far. And the man was watching her. One of the officers reached for the doorknob and twisted. Locked. He turned to his partner. "Something's wrong. We're going in." The third officer, the quiet one, was already moving around the side of the house, checking for another way in. The tallest officer took a step back, bracing himself. "On three," he muttered. Inside, the man took a slow step forward. The girl flinched. Outside, the officers counted down. 1, 2. Then, something unexpected happened. The little girl's eyes widened, because from down the hallway, beyond the man's shoulder, she saw something move. Something familiar. And then she heard it, a voice, weak but unmistakable. "Baby." Her mother. The little girl's heart leaped. "Mom." The man's jaw tightened. Outside, the officers reached 3. And then, with one hard shove, they forced the door open. The door flew open with a crash. The officers stormed inside, their eyes sweeping the dimly lit hallway. The house smelled musty, like something had been left unattended for too long. The little girl stood frozen near the entrance, her wide eyes darting between the man in the shadows and the officers now closing in. The tallest officer immediately spotted her. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice steady but urgent. She didn't answer. Her small hands trembled, and her gaze flickered past him toward the hallway, toward where she had heard her mother's voice. The man, still standing a few feet away, didn't move. He didn't run. He didn't speak. He simply stared at them, his expression unreadable. The second officer, the one with sharp eyes, stepped forward. "Sir, put your hands where we can see them." His voice was firm, but there was a warning edge to it. The man's lips parted slightly, as if he were about to say something. But then, from the back of the house, a sound, a faint shuffle. The little girl's head snapped toward it. "Mom." Her voice was barely above a whisper. The officer's attention shifted instantly. The third officer, the quiet one, was already moving toward the noise, his hand hovering near his holster. He turned a corner and disappeared into the hallway. The man in the shadows finally spoke. "You don't understand." His voice was calm, eerily calm. "I'm not here to hurt anyone." The tallest officer didn't lower his guard, then step away, slowly. The man sighed, his shoulders sagging. He took a step back, his hands lifting slightly. "I was trying to help," he murmured. The second officer didn't buy it. Help with what? Before the man could answer, the quiet officer's voice rang out from down the hall. "I found her." The little girl bolted before anyone could stop her. She ran past the man, past the officers, straight toward her mother's voice. The tallest officer moved fast, following her. They reached a small bedroom at the end of the hall. The quiet officer was crouched beside the bed, his face tense. And there, slumped against the nightstand, was the girl's mother. Her eyes fluttered open at the sound of footsteps. She looked disoriented, weak. A bruise darkened her forehead. The little girl dropped to her knees. "Mom." The woman's breath shuddered. Baby, her voice cracked. She reached out a shaky hand, brushing her daughter's cheek. The tallest officer knelt beside her. Ma'am, can you hear me? What happened? Her eyes moved slowly, unfocused. He helped me, she whispered. The officers stiffened. The quiet officer glanced back toward the hallway, where the man still stood under the watch of his partner. The little girl clutched her mother's arm, as if afraid to let go. The mother tried to sit up, wincing in pain. He found me, she murmured. I don't remember much. I fell. I think I hit my head. The second officer exchanged a wary look with his partner. So you're saying he didn't do this to you? The woman shook her head weakly. No. The little girl's fingers tightened on her mother's sleeve. I was so scared, she whispered. The tallest officer softened. You're okay now, he assured her. But inside, his mind was racing. If this man wasn't the threat, then what was? Back in the hallway, the second officer turned to the man. Start talking. Now. The man exhaled slowly. I was just passing by, he said. I saw her through the window. She was on the floor, barely moving. He paused, his gaze flickering toward the mother's bedroom. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to break in, but I couldn't just leave. The officers studied him carefully, weighing his words. I knocked, the man continued. I called out. No answer. The door was unlocked, so I stepped inside. She was barely conscious. He rubbed his face. I was about to call for help when I heard someone outside. The officers exchanged glances. The timeline matched up. The mother had clearly been in distress, but that didn't explain everything. The second officer narrowed his eyes. If you were trying to help, why didn't you call 911 right away? The man hesitated, because he shifted uncomfortably. I didn't think anyone would believe me. That set off alarms. The tallest officer, now walking back into the hallway, folded his arms. Why wouldn't we believe you? The man swallowed. Because I've been in trouble before. Silence. The officers tensed. The second officer's jaw clenched. What kind of trouble? The man didn't answer right away. His fingers twitched at his sides. He glanced at the little girl, then at her mother, then back to the officers. The quiet officer, still standing near the mother, spoke for the first time in a while. His voice was even careful. What aren't you telling us? The man exhaled, his eyes dark with something unreadable. I knew her husband. The room went still. The little girl's head jerked up. Daddy. The mother flinched. A shadow passed over her face. The second officer's grip tightened. Where is he now? The man's expression hardened. That's what I was trying to find out. For the first time since stepping into the house, the officers felt it, the deeper tension, the weight of something unspoken. Because now they weren't just dealing with a stranger in a house. Now they had an even bigger question. Where was the girl's father? And why did this man seem so afraid of the answer? The room was thick with silence. The little girl's wide eyes flicked between the officers and the man who had spoken her father's name. Her small fingers clung tightly to her mother's sleeve, searching for comfort, but she could feel the way her mother had stiffened. The tallest officer stepped forward. His voice was steady, but his muscles were tense. What do you mean you knew her husband? The man didn't look at him. Instead, his gaze remained fixed on the mother, as if waiting for her to say something. But she didn't. She just stared back, her lips pressed together, her breathing uneven. The second officer, the one with sharp eyes, took a step closer. You need to be straight with us. Right now. The man exhaled sharply, glancing at the little girl. I didn't know he had a kid, he muttered. The mother flinched, and the officers caught it. The tallest one watched her carefully. Where is he now? For a long moment, she didn't answer. Then finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know. The second officer studied her, not fully convinced. When was the last time you saw him? She hesitated, her fingers tightening in her daughter's hair. It's been a while. The man scoffed under his breath, shaking his head. A while. His voice was low, almost bitter. That's one way to put it. The officers shifted, their unease growing. The quiet officer, still standing near the doorway, finally spoke. "What do you know about him?" he asked the man. The man's jaw clenched. "I know he wasn't a good person." The little girl's face twisted in confusion. "But he's my daddy." The words hung heavy in the air. The mother's hand trembled as she reached for her daughter, pulling her close. The tallest officer turned back to the man. "What exactly are you saying?" The man exhaled through his nose. "I'm saying that if he's back, then they're not safe." A chill ran through the room. The officers exchanged quick glances. The second officer's fingers flexed at his side. "Are you telling us that you think he's here? In town?" The man's eyes darkened. "I think he's been here the whole time." The mother squeezed her daughter tighter. "No," she whispered. "That's not possible." The tallest officer kept his gaze locked on the man. "You're going to have to give us more than that." The man hesitated, his hands curled into fists at his sides. "I used to know him. A long time ago." He swallowed hard. "I know what he's capable of." The second officer's jaw tightened. Capable of what? The man didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was quiet, but the weight of his words sent a shiver through the room. "Hurting people." The little girl shifted, sensing the fear in her mother's grip. "Mommy," she whispered. The mother forced a weak smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "It's okay, baby." But it wasn't. The officers felt it now, the sense that something much bigger was happening here. This wasn't just about a man in the house. This was about someone who wasn't there, someone who might be watching from the shadows, waiting. The tallest officer spoke first. "We need to secure this house. Now." The second officer was already moving, glancing toward the windows, the doors. The quiet officer pulled out his radio, calling for backup. The man exhaled sharply. "If you really want to help them, you should be looking for him." The second officer turned back. "And where do you think we should start?" The man's face darkened. "Where it all started." The mother paled. The tallest officer caught the look in her eyes. "What happened there?" She shook her head quickly. "No, we're not going back there." The little girl watched her mother, confused. "Where?" The mother's hands trembled. "The house." The man nodded grimly. "Yeah, the house." The second officer narrowed his eyes. "What house?" The mother swallowed hard. "Where we used to live, before." The officers exchanged glances. The quiet officer was already flipping through his notes, checking addresses. "We need to move fast," he muttered. The tallest officer turned to the mother. "What aren't you telling us?" She hesitated. Then finally she whispered, "I left that place for a reason." The man scoffed. "And you think he stayed away?" "No, he's been waiting." The little girl's tiny voice cut through the air. "Is Daddy coming home?" No one answered. Because, deep down, they were all starting to realize the truth. Maybe he was already here. The mother's breath came faster now, her grip tightening on her daughter as if she could shield her from something unseen. The officers weren't just looking at her anymore. They were watching her, studying her every reaction. She knew what they were thinking. She knew they were beginning to realize that there was more to this than what she had told them. The second officer's voice was firm but calm. "We need to know what happened in that house." The mother shook her head quickly. "No, I'm not going back there." The man in the hallway, the one who had been watching everything unfold, let out a low breath. "Then you're not going to stop him." Her eyes snapped to his. There was something in his tone, something final. The tallest officer studied him carefully. "You keep talking like you know what's going on. If you have information, now's the time." The man hesitated, glancing at the little girl. For a brief second, something flickered across his face. Guilt. Then he took a step forward, lowering his voice. "He never left that house." The room went still. The mother paled. "That's not true." The man's jaw tightened. isn't it?" He turned to the officers. "You think he just disappeared? Just walked away from his family and never looked back? That's not who he was." The second officer frowned. "If he never left, then where has he been?" The man swallowed hard. "I don't know, but I know he's not gone." The quiet officer, still flipping through his notes, suddenly stopped. His eyes narrowed. Something's not right. The others turned toward him. He raised his head, his expression tense. There was never a missing persons report filed for him. The mother stiffened. The tallest officer's brow furrowed. "What?" The quiet officer tapped his notebook. "If he disappeared, someone should have reported it. There's nothing. Not a single record." He looked at the mother. "Why didn't you report him missing?" The mother's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Her fingers curled into the fabric of her daughter's shirt. The second officer's eyes darkened, because she knew where he was. The little girl looked up at her mother, confused. "Mommy." The mother sucked in a shaky breath. I thought he was gone." The man in the hallway let out a bitter chuckle. "No, you didn't." The tallest officer's voice was sharp now. "Tell us the truth." The mother's hands trembled. She looked at her daughter, then back at the officers. For a moment, she looked like she might not say anything at all. Then, "I never reported him missing because I didn't have to," she whispered. The room seemed to shrink. The second officer's voice was low. "Where is he?" Tears welled in her eyes. "I don't know." The man in the hallway shook his head. "You buried the past, but it never went away." A sharp knock at the front door made everyone jump. The officers reacted instantly, hands moving toward their holsters. The second officer moved toward the door, peering through the peephole. His body stiffened. The tallest officer narrowed his eyes. "Who is it?" The second officer's voice was tight. "A neighbor." He opened the door a crack, just enough to see a woman standing on the porch. She looked nervous, her hands wringing together. "I heard voices," she said quickly. "Is everything okay?" The second officer studied her carefully. "Everything's under control, ma'am." The woman hesitated, glancing past him into the house. Then she leaned in slightly. I don't want to cause trouble, but I thought I should tell you." She swallowed. "I saw someone." The officer's jaw clenched. "When?" She licked her lips. "Earlier tonight, out back, near the trees." She glanced behind her, as if afraid to say more. "I thought maybe it was just a shadow, but then I saw him move." The officers exchanged sharp looks. The tallest officer's voice was urgent now. "Did you see his face?" The woman hesitated, then shook her head. "No, but he was tall. He was just standing there, watching the house." A chill settled over the room. The second officer turned back inside, his mind racing. The mother's breathing was uneven. The little girl clung to her, her small hands gripping tightly. The tallest officer moved toward the back of the house, peering out through the window. The yard stretched into darkness, the trees swaying slightly in the wind. He scanned the area, his pulse quickening. The man in the hallway took a slow step forward. "I told you," he murmured. "He never left." And then, a noise. From outside, a soft, deliberate scrape against the back door. The mother gasped, clutching her daughter. The officers stiffened, their hands hovering near their weapons. The quiet officer muttered into his radio, calling for backup. The tallest officer turned back to the mother. "Lock yourselves in the bedroom. Now." The mother didn't hesitate this time. She scooped her daughter into her arms and ran. The second officer moved to the back door, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. He pressed his back to the wall, motioning for the others to get into position. For a long moment, there was nothing. Just silence. Then, a single knock. Slow, deliberate. The little girl's voice echoed from down the hall, barely above a whisper. "Daddy." And the back door handle turned. The officers froze, their hands tightening around their holsters as the back door handle twisted. The sound was slow, deliberate, almost taunting. The mother held her daughter close, backing into the bedroom as she locked the door behind her. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. The second officer signaled to his partner, moving into position. The room was filled with a thick, suffocating silence. The only sound was the faint creak of the door handle moving again, this time with more force. Then, suddenly, bang! The back door slammed against the frame, but it didn't open. The officers exchanged a tense glance, their bodies rigid. Someone was trying to get in. The tallest officer took a slow, measured breath. "Step away from the door," he called out. No response. A shadow moved outside the window. The second officer took a cautious step forward, his voice firm. "Identify yourself." Still silence. Then, footsteps, moving away. The officers rushed toward the back door, pulling it open. The yard was empty, the wind whispering through the trees. The neighbor's porch light flickered in the distance, casting long shadows across the grass. Nothing. No sign of anyone. The second officer scanned the area, his jaw tight. He was just here. The tallest officer turned back toward the house, his mind racing. The man in the hallway hadn't moved. He just stood there watching. "He's not gone," the man muttered. "He's waiting." The second officer narrowed his eyes. "For what?" The man exhaled. "For her to remember." A chill crawled up the officer's spine. He turned back toward the bedroom. The mother. Something wasn't right. He moved quickly down the hall, knocking on the bedroom door. "It's us," he called out. "It's safe." There was a pause, then the lock clicked. The door opened slightly, and the mother's face appeared, her expression pale. She looked down at her daughter, then back at the officer. "He was here, wasn't he?" she whispered. The officer hesitated, then nodded. "But he's gone now." The mother's hands trembled. "No," she said softly. "He's never gone." The second officer exchanged a glance with his partner. "What does that mean?" The mother inhaled shakily. "I never told you everything." The man in the hallway stepped forward, his voice quiet. "Tell them." The mother's grip on her daughter tightened. "That house," she whispered. "The one we left." She swallowed hard. "He never walked out of it." A heavy silence fell over the room. The quiet officer frowned. "Then where'd he go?" The mother exhaled, her voice barely audible. "I buried him." The officers stiffened. The man in the hallway let out a slow breath. She did what she had to do. The second officer's stomach tightened. "You're saying he's—" The mother nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I thought it was over. I thought if I left, if I never spoke about it again, we could move on." She looked at her daughter. "I didn't want her to grow up knowing." The tallest officer's grip tightened. Then he was outside. The mother shook her head. "I don't know." The wind howled against the windows, rattling the glass. The little girl stirred in her mother's arms, shifting uncomfortably. Then she whispered something. Something that sent a chill down everyone's spine. "I see him." The mother stiffened. The officers turned sharply. "Where?" The little girl blinked, her small hands curling into her mother's shirt. "By the trees." The officers spun back toward the window. And there, standing just at the edge of the yard, was a figure. Tall, still, watching. The second officer's breath caught. "That's impossible." The mother's voice broke. "No." Then, the figure moved, stepping forward. And the little girl whispered again, her voice barely a breath. "Daddy." The mother's breath hitched as her daughter's small voice echoed in the silence. The officers remained frozen, staring out at the dark yard where the figure stood just beyond the trees. He didn't move like someone who was lost or confused. He stood with purpose, as if he had always been there waiting. The tallest officer stepped forward, gripping his radio. "We need backup now," he muttered. The second officer squinted into the darkness, his pulse pounding. "That's not possible," he whispered. "If he's..." He didn't finish the sentence. He couldn't. The mother's fingers trembled as she brushed her daughter's hair back. "Baby," she whispered, her voice barely holding steady. "What do you see?" The little girl kept her eyes fixed on the figure. "He's looking at us." The mother swallowed hard. Then, the figure moved. One step forward, then another. The officers tensed, their hands hovering over their holsters. But something about the way he walked made them hesitate. He wasn't running. He wasn't charging toward them. He was just approaching. The mother's breath came faster. "It's not him," she whispered. "It can't be." But deep down she wasn't sure. The second officer took a slow step toward the back door. "Sir, stop right there," he called out. The figure halted. Silence stretched between them. The night air was heavy, thick with tension. The officers waited for a response, for some sign that this was a misunderstanding, that this was just a neighbor, a stranger, anyone other than who they feared it was. And then, a voice, low, quiet, and unmistakable. "You took everything from me." The mother's stomach dropped. The little girl clung to her tighter, burying her face in her mother's shoulder. The officers stiffened. The second officer's voice was sharp now. "Who are you?" The figure took another step, and for the first time, the porch light caught part of his face. Pale, hollow eyes. A face that had once been familiar, now distorted by time, by something unnatural. The mother's knees nearly gave out. "No," she whispered. "You're gone." The figure tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "You thought you could bury me." A cold shiver ran down the second officer's spine. He turned to the mother. "Is this?" "I don't know," she said quickly, shaking her head. "I don't know what this is." But the man outside didn't stop. He moved closer, his voice calm but full of something dark. "You should have told the truth." The mother's breath hitched. "I did what I had to do." The figure paused, standing just at the edge of the porch now. His gaze flicked to the little girl. "She remembers," he murmured. The little girl peeked up from her mother's shoulder, her small face confused. "Daddy." The mother's heart twisted. She wanted to shield her daughter from this, to keep her safe from whatever this was. But it was too late. The tallest officer took charge, stepping in front of the mother and child. "I don't know who you are," he said, his voice steady, "but you need to leave. Now." The figure didn't flinch. "She was supposed to love me," he said quietly, his eyes still on the mother. The mother's vision blurred with tears. "I did," she whispered. The wind howled through the trees, sending leaves skittering across the yard. The figure stood there, unmoving, watching. Then, he took a step back, then another, and just as quickly as he had appeared, he faded into the darkness, disappearing beyond the trees. The officers rushed out onto the porch, scanning the yard with their flashlights, their radios crackling with updates from the incoming units. But there was nothing. No footprints, no movement, nothing. The mother's hands trembled as she clutched her daughter, still staring at the spot where he had stood. The second officer turned back to her, his voice softer now. "Are you okay?" She nodded, but the truth was, she wasn't sure. The tallest officer let out a slow breath. "Who was he?" The mother hesitated. Then finally she whispered, "My past." The officers didn't press further. Some things they'd understood were better left buried. The little girl yawned, curling into her mother's arms. "He's gone," she murmured sleepily. The mother pressed a kiss to her daughter's forehead, holding her close. "Yes," she whispered, "he's gone." And in the silence that followed, as the night stretched on and the shadows faded, she allowed herself to believe it, even if deep down she knew. Some ghosts never really leave.